Thanks, Phil. Perfect. Thanks, Phil. So we're going to open it in a good way, and I'm going to pass this off to Kathy Horn. She's from Sayot and is also part of New Chalmers, and she's with her husband, Doug LaFortune. Anytime, Kathy. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Kathleen Horn here in Sayot. I would like to welcome everyone to this meeting of this very important work, and I'm thankful that we're honored to be welcoming you in a good way. As you start your work this evening, we are situated ourselves in Wasanich territory, but majority of our work is in the Lekwungen Songhees area. Myself being of New Channel heritage, my family is from Sishot and Port Alberni and Pochidot in Port Renfrew, both of which have been hugely affected by the tsunamis in the past. When I was a young girl, we were evacuated out of Port Alberni when the tsunami hit. I can't remember what year.
I think it was 64 or something, 65, something like that, when they had a big earthquake in Alaska.
So opening in a good way, thank you everyone, as we bring our start our meeting in a good way, asking for the Creator to guide us through our meeting this evening. Thankful that we are brought together in a good way, healthy and strong, and hoping that our participants that have yet to join will be able to when they are able. So thank you. Hi.
True. Thank you, Kathy. And it's always wonderful to start in a good way and have your presence here. As part of this project, of course, we would like to acknowledge our Indigenous collaborators. We have done some extensive work and interviews with the Cayuquet, Checklisset First Nations, New Chatlet First Nation, Ihadisat, Chinnikink, Mocha Muchlat, Quatsino First Nation. And also Tim Paul contributed a lot, and he's from Hesquit First Nation, and his grandmother was from New Chatlet. Next slide, please. So I'm speaking from the territory of the Cowichan tribes, and as you can see, my name is Peter Romer. That's my English name. My my Niska name is Wa'asam Gan, which means wooden bowl. And I'm the Indigenous Community Liaison for Ocean Networks Canada. And Niska, they come, I come from the Lachilu, which is the Wolf Clan in the Nassa Valley. And my Dutch side of the family, where Romer comes from, is from Friesland in Northern Holland. And we were seafarers that go back to the 1600s. Next slide, please.
Oh, we'll pass it to Taryn there.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Forget about those guys. No, I'm just kidding.
Thanks, Peter. No worries. Yeah, welcome everybody. My name is Taryn Moore. I'm also calling from Lekwungen Songhees territory in beautiful Victoria. Background is British on my mother's side and British on my father's side. Third generation Canadian, but mostly raised in the mountains and rivers in the BC, but have been in Lekwungen territory for about 20 years. And my background is in emergency management. I'm specifically focused on seismic hazards. So that's earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanoes. And really, I'm part of Northwest Seismic Consultants, and we're really focused on earthquake and tsunami warning systems, readiness programs that are strengths-based, innovative, practical, cost-effective, and scalable, and that demonstrate leadership and safety. So thanks for letting me be here and participating in this project. Over to you, Phil.
Thanks, Taryn. And myself, my name is Philippe Saint-Germain. I work for Northwest Hydraulic Consultants. I'm a project manager as well as a coastal engineer. I'm from Gatineau, Quebec. I studied at the University of Ottawa. The topic of my master's was the effects of tsunamis on structures. And I'm thankful to live, play, and work on the unceded territory of the Squamish First Nation. Next slide. So this is the agenda for the presentation this evening. We started with the meeting opening and the introductions. I'm going to talk about the other team members. So a lot of acknowledgements there. Introduce the project to the ones that are not familiar with the project. We're going to discuss the three components of the project: community and Indigenous engagement, tsunami hazard and analysis, and all the maps that show tsunami hazard in the study area that were produced as part of this project. Essentially look at the risk. What are the risks in the study area? We're going to talk about how to manage these risks and what are measures that can be adopted to reduce these risks. And then we're going to wrap it up with a conclusion and some step forwards. And then we're going to open the floor for questions from the audience. We have a lot of information to present. It's been a long project. We're gonna go quite quickly over the slides, but we're gonna just give you the nutshell that's really needed. But at the end, if there's any questions and you want us to touch more on a particular matter, then we'll be happy to do that. Next slide. So yeah, as I said, next slide, you can go. This project has been a long time coming, and there's been a whole team of individuals working on this project from the Strathcona Regional District, from Northwest Hydraulic Consultants, at Ocean Networks Canada, and as well Northwest Seismic Consultants. So all of that and all of these individuals put a lot of effort, and really, based with all these efforts and contribution, we were able to present to you this evening, the result of our study. Next slide. And now, just to introduce you about the project. So basically, the main objective of the project is to understand what are the tsunami hazards through computer modeling, but also drawing upon Indigenous knowledge and community experience. And so this image that you see there, it shows our study area, which is essentially the northwest coast of Vancouver Island. And our study area spans from Gold River to the south all the way to Cape Scott. Because it's such a vast area, we have to concentrate in different areas. And the project is divided in two phases. So there's phase one that focuses on Cayucot Sound, as well as Esperanza Inlet, and that's shown by the green squares on the screen there. And we are just about to start phase two, which will cover the communities that are within the dash rectangles that you see on the screen. So basically, also as part of these objectives is to undertake a community level risk assessment to identify what is the risk to people and also assets like buildings, roads, and critical infrastructure. This information is going to support emergency management, so how to manage these risks and develop evacuation plans, and also other risk reduction measures. But mainly, one of the main objectives is really to simply raise awareness and share with people the information that they need to know in order to keep safe in the event of a tsunami. Next slide, please. So this slide is kind of explain why we're looking at this. So basically, around the Pacific Ocean, there's what we call the Ring of Fire. And what that is a continuous series of subduction zones. So what are subduction zones? They're essentially areas where tectonic plates slide on one another. And when there's an earthquake, in those zones, you basically have a sudden lift of the seafloor that creates a lift in the water surface that then propagates as tsunami waves. So what you see there is that the entire west coast of North America is exposed to tsunamis coming from any of these locations, especially from Japan, from Alaska, or even Chile. So for instance, in 1964, there was a big earthquake in Alaska that reached Vancouver Island within 3 to 4 hours and caused some damage, for instance, at Port Alberni, which is well known there. But what makes Vancouver Island particularly at risk of tsunamis is the presence of the Cascadia subduction zone, which is just a few hundred kilometers off the coast, which means that you would have a very large tsunami arriving in a very short amount of time. Next slide, please. So how are we going to assess those risks? So here's a slide that presents our methodology. So basically, we want to address these risks, but we have a focus. And in this case here is making sure that there's space for everyone around the table. And this, as part of this project, the engagement with the community and the Indigenous engagement was really a key piece of the project. So there was essentially 3 pieces to the project: the community and Indigenous engagement, which we'll cover in a few more slides; the analysis, so essentially the technical analysis of the hazard and the mapping of the hazard; and then the assessment of the risk, which is essentially understanding, so what are the risks that we're dealing with. And all this information, how do we apply this information, is that it helps communities and neighborhoods and just communities and groups to better develop their emergency management plans and also adopt measures for the reduction of risks. Next slide, please. And I will pass it to Peter.
Community Indigenous engagement. Next slide, please. So, of course, we engaged with our Indigenous partners, and we held AG meetings with the municipalities and our Indigenous collaborators throughout the phase 1, which provided valuable input into our inundation mapping. The advisory group also provided areas of interest, such as sacred sites, fishing grounds, old village sites, and other traditional territories of where people would be. Maybe they're gathering seaweed on the rocks, maybe they're in their favorite fishing spot. So we took a lot of these really remote areas into account and got great feedback from our partners. Next slide. So we held many interviews with the elders or the knowledge holders from each community to get the full comprehensive story. We dug quite deep, as far as we could go, from 1700 to now, to get the whole complete picture. And we also, for instance, the 64 tsunami, it was able to give us the boots on the ground scenario. How did the wave interact with the people? How did they interact with the wave, and so forth during 64? We heard stories of what Georgina Amos told us about, that she was in the hall, and the hall moved across the street in Zabalos, and it shook the ground. That tsunami shook the ground, and all the bottom fish had come up, and they got so interested in the bottom fish they kind of forgot about the tsunami, jumped in their boats and started collecting fish. And so this gives us a better understanding how people sometimes interact with these events. On the right of this slide, you'll see an image. This is a vectorized image that was done by renowned artist Tim Paul, and it's of earthquake foot legend. Which is a gentleman was invited to sit around the fire with the mountain dwarves or supernatural beings, and he accidentally stepped on their drum, and every time he stepped or tried to shake the drum off his foot, he caused an earthquake and tsunami. Next slide, please. So yeah, I'll pass this off to Phil.
Yeah, so as part of the engagement, there were several community touch points because really the risk assessment, we need to understand what is at risk and who lives and what are their activities and their livelihood in the area under study. So it's really important to reach out and obtain inputs to understand really what's out there exposed to tsunamis. So to do that, we had 3 touch points. The first one being a project webpage that was hosted by the SRD, and that provided overview of the project, background information on tsunamis. It provides all the tsunami maps produced as part of this project, as well as safety information. But more importantly, on this webpage, it was used to advertise and promote a community survey to build preparedness and awareness, essentially, but to kind of understand how people are prepared or aware of tsunami risk in their communities and what to do in the event of a tsunami. And also we had several public meetings to review preliminary results as they were being produced throughout the project, collect their inputs, see what we were doing right, what we're doing wrong. And then as well, we right now, as the final step really is to share the finalized information for helping communities to better prepare and understanding what are the next steps to reduce tsunami risk. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we'll go into tsunami, the hazard analysis and the mapping. Next slide, please. So we'll talk about the numerical model. So essentially is the computers and the models that we've used to simulate or predict what would be the behavior of a tsunami as it would impact the northwest coast of Vancouver Island. So the first step in doing so is develop a digital elevation model that we call. And what that is, it's essentially a virtual surface represented in a computer that represents the surface of the earth and the bottom of the sea. We collected, as part of this project, a lot of field data to build this surface there, and we used that in a computer model as the underlying surface, if we want, for propagating a tsunami over that surface. We modeled 4 scenarios, so the Cascadia tsunami, similar to the one that occurred in 1700, and as well recalled and recorded by legends of Indigenous First Nations. An Alaska tsunami, so in more recent history, both of those with current sea level, and as well the same tsunami scenarios with sea level rise in the future. Next slide, please. Just going quickly over the technical description of the tsunami model. So we considered 2 tsunami sources. What sources are really is a definition of the displacement of the seafloor, essentially, and how that creates the wave. And from there, the tsunami model propagates that wave in the ocean and in the steady area. So tsunami sources were acquired from Natural Resources Canada in the case of the Cascadia tsunami, and from the University of Alaska Fairbanks in the case of the 1964 tsunamis. The water levels are really important in this type of work because the inundation is influenced by what water level that you consider in your simulation. So in this case, we considered a tide level corresponding to high water mean tide. Essentially what that is the average of the higher tide over a period of corresponding to 19 years. We considered projections of sea level rise based on Natural Resources Canada, and as well the subsidence of the Cascadia earthquake. So essentially after a Cascadia earthquake, because of this motion of the tectonic plate, the land will lower. So closer to the coast, we're talking to 1 to 2 meter approximately that the land will lower. And as we go further inland, the subduction or the downward motion of the land becomes less. But when your land lowers by a meter, then that increases significantly the chances of flooding. And we considered basically two types or two resolution or level of detail for tsunami modeling. So for the entire study area, which is shown by the red rectangle there, that was a coarser resolution. And then we looked in more detail. So we use a finer model resolution in the areas covered by phase 1 of this project, as shown by the green rectangles there on the screen. Next slide, please. So this shows essentially the effects of the two tsunamis that we studied. On the left, you have a Cascadia tsunami similar to the one of 1700. So you can see very dark reds, which mean large wave amplitude, very close to Vancouver Island and the west coast of North America. So a very direct threat and exposure. And then you see that the tsunami propagates to the west towards the other side of the Pacific Ocean. And then on the right, you have the 1964 tsunami. And this from Alaska, this is a distant tsunami because the earthquake shaking will not be felt. So essentially there'll be no natural warning. There'll be some warning from buoys that are deployed in the ocean, and the message is relayed to the different systems to communicate those warnings to the population. But basically you see that because of the orientation of the fault, it project the tsunami wave towards Vancouver Island. And in the case of all the distant tsunamis that can come anywhere around that ring of fire I talked about earlier, this is the one that is considered the most adverse. And I'll pass it back to Peter so he can bring us, inform us on some interesting stories about these tsunamis.
Thank you, Phil. We'll play the simulation. So the 1700 tsunami, some of the oral stories, one was passed down by Chief Louis Nukamis from Pachena Bay, and the Pachena Bay were completely wiped out in their amalgamation now. But the people the community who were called House Up Against the Hill, they were up because they were high enough. They did not get wiped out, and but the people in Pachena Bay, they all drifted out to sea. And I believe there's a story of one person who survived, who tied off his canoe to a tree. The other stories are that in Nuka Sound, the Mocha Muchlat, Ray Williams, who's from Uquat, spoke about how the 1700 tsunami, there's evidence of all the beach pebbles were pushed into a lake, which is only about 300 feet from the ocean. And Roger Dunlop spoke about, who's from New Tribal Council. He brought it to our attention, Ghost Lagoon, which was a deserted community, most likely due to tsunamis, and also deserted lake, which had evidence of many tsunami impacts in the sediment. And he got hit so many times that eventually these villages were completely abandoned. Next slide. Thank you. I'll hand it over to Phil. Oh, you're muted, Phil.
Classic. Yeah, I'm just going to summarize some of the observations that can be made from the previous video in general. What you see on this slide essentially is the amplitude. So essentially the magnitude of the tsunami wave as it interacts with the very complex coast of Northwest Vancouver Island. Just to go quickly, what the color scheme means is that when you have a pale, almost like an off-white or beige, that means quite small amplitude. We're talking about 0 to 0.5 meters. And then as you increase the warmth, if you want, of the color, so when you go to yellow and orange, you have an increase in the amplitude. And then the dark purple, that's greater than 6 meters of wave amplitude. So the highest wave is in the order of 10 meters on the open coast, and generally speaking, what happens in many instances is in inlets further inland, you have an amplification effect of the tsunami wave, as you can see if we go up Klupana Inlet in Nootka Sound, where you have a darker purple at the very end of the inlet. So these amplification is quite often in the area. And also something that is quite noticeable is simply that the coast to the south of Brooks Peninsula, the amplitude is more severe compared to north of Brooks Peninsula. And this is essentially based on the definition of the subduction zone, basically. Next slide, please. Just to speak about the flow velocities that would be induced by the tsunami. So the passage of the wave itself in deep water doesn't create much motion, forward motion of the water. You will imagine that you're a floating bottle, or you're on a boat, in different areas where you have very light colors, for instance. The wave comes by, you're going to be going up and down. The velocity, the water moving forward is very strong and higher when you have shallower depth. So for instance, Gillam Channel, which is just south of Chenekant over here, the depth is only 20 to 30 meters with respect to chart datum, which is quite shallow in relation to the length of the tsunami waves. Then you'll have very strong currents shown by the red colors there. But as you go further inside the inlet, then the velocity drops down again, where it's closer to almost not moving or less than 3 knots. Water can also be accelerated when you go through narrow passages. Like if you look at Tassus Narrows, just a little bit more south than Tassus here, this area, because it's so narrow, when the wave reaches one side of the narrows, the water will flow to the other side, for instance, and create a lot of velocity, which is hazardous to boaters. And just to give you a rough idea of the color scale there, 0 to 3 knots, those are currents that are naturally occurring with astronomical tides, for instance, depending at different locations on the west coast of British Columbia. And when you go to 3 to 6 knots, that's when you have passages and rapids. And if you navigate through this, it's possible, but then you might want to wait for a more favorable stage of tides, so the currents are less. But when we're looking at 6 knots and over, it becomes very hazardous and very dangerous. So that's reflected by the color scale there on the map. Next slide, please. And Peter, back to you with the 1964 tsunami.
Can we go just one slide back? So just in regards to this, I just want to speak that Frank Chili in the 64 tsunami in Cayuga, his house is on pylons or stilts, and it passed up about 6 feet high, and at about 1 foot into the living room, the ocean came in. And also down by Zabalos, where Georgina Amos spoke about the fish being around, as you can see, there's very little impact. So maybe why they weren't as worried about other waves coming. And kind of just up from Zabalos, Queen's Cove was also the witnesses said the wave it was just kind of a strong current to just bypass their community and then affect their community. Next slide, please. So that the earthquake that of 64, March 27th, for Alaska, tsunami occurred around 6:30 p.m. And Pacific Daylight Savings Time, and reached Vancouver Island within about 3 to 4 hours after the earthquake occurred in Alaska. And at the time of arrival, the stage of the tide was approximately 3 meters high. And just outside of our study area, of course, we know about the 64 tsunami, but there was this one story that stuck with me. This grandmother told me that she heard all this rumbling in her house. She woke up and she looked out the window and she saw that she was floating down the street. And then I always like to joke that she went back to bed. So yeah, very interesting how everybody, had so many different experiences. And I'll pass it off to or nope, sorry, this is me still. Next slide, please. So as you can see, where the orange is where the higher waves are, of course. It builds up through that inlet, as Phil was mentioning. You know, some of the other stories that we got, Ray Williams in Mochalat territory near Yuquat, he was working on as a logger in Gold River, and the waves bypassed Yuquat and shot up the inlet, one towards Tasses, one towards Gold River. And he was in the bunkhouse, I guess he was, which are on 4-foot spruce logs, and that completely got engulfed in water. And he was 14 years old at the time. From an interview with Chief Tom Nelson from the Quatsino First Nation in Quatsino Inlet, Tom's friend had a cabin near Port Alice, which had been moved 200 feet from its original location. And as you can see up near Port Alice there, it's in the orange area. And he said his father's boat broke loose from where it was moored and was lifted by the wave and landed on a piling, putting a hole in the hull. There was damage to other boats and infrastructure like the docks in Port Alice, but nobody was hurt from what he remembers. Tom said he would have been about 18 at the time when the tsunami hit. And yeah, very fascinating. And then I'll pass it on to Phil. Thank you.
Yeah, so just staying on that slide there, I just want to recap and emphasize how this information, these stories, firsthand experiences that Peter just shared with us is really important for this study, especially the 1700. That was a long time ago. So this, there wasn't any recording or any data on that tsunami. But even the 1964, this part of Vancouver Island is quite remote, and we don't have a lot of data or information that to which we can compare our results, basically, and essentially how the results relate to the actual stories and how it all kind of pieces itself together really substantiate our results and give us the confidence that our model is working properly. So I just wanted to highlight this very important piece, and I think it's great. Okay, next slide. So this one here is just to show that even during the Alaska tsunami, you would also have strong velocity that would occur on the coast in different areas. The velocity would be milder in most areas, but you still have higher velocities, especially in constrictions and in shallow areas. Next slide, please. Now I'm just going to talk a little bit about the maps. A lot of maps were produced as part of this project. Essentially, the maps identify the hazards, so it tells you where it's dangerous and where areas are safer. For instance, we produced a lot of them. There's a lot of details about it. So I'm going to go quite quickly here, but in a nutshell, we map two kinds of overwater hazards. So the hazards that you'd be worried about when you're in your boat, and that's the height or the amplitude of the tsunami, as well as how fast, how quick the currents would be moving under you. And we looked at different scales, but mainly we mapped some regional scales, and those are the ones that you see on the image there. So that's the layout of the areas that are covered under those maps, and those maps are available online at the link shown on the screen here. Next slide, please. And then more importantly is we also map the inundation that could be expected for both the Cascadia and the Alaska tsunami. So this is on the right, the image shows the layout of these maps, and they kind of reflect the areas of interest that Peter shared with us earlier that were established with the advisory group. And just for technical information is that the inundation was mapped based on interpretation of the model results and applying a safety factor as well. And these maps are available online at the moment. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the risk, basically. So now that we know what's the hazard, what's the danger, then we have to understand, okay, what is in the path of the danger? So that's really is what's the risk. Next slide, please. So basically, we produce another series of maps. Those ones are called the assets at risk. And basically on these maps, it shows the inundation from the tsunami, but also identifies how people would be at risk by highlighting the roads, their buildings. Those are assets basically for communities. And then the critical assets for response and recovery, which is basically perhaps a fire station, your police station, your Coast Guard station. Those are very important assets, or ELF center, that during, so how to support the evacuation and the alerting of the population, but also for recovery and after the ELF center, of course, and other facilities like that. So those are identified on these maps, and these one we'll see a few later in this presentation here. Next slide, please. Quick slide here to illustrate the impacts of tsunamis on life safety and infrastructure. So there's a few images there of one of my trips to Japan in my grad studies, but basically we have to think that in the event of a tsunami and the flooding, the water level will change so quickly that the water will be flowing very, very fast and will be very, very dangerous if you get caught in the water. And it's important to keep in mind that tsunamis are just not one wave approaching and inundating the area, but also several waves. And the waves will usually come and recede over an hour or so, or half an hour, and then come back and then recede. So you have this very strong flow, destructive flows that just comes and hits, your infrastructures, back and forth. And that can last several hours or even days. The flow is very strong. It's often laden with floating debris, could be car, buildings, logs. So generally speaking, it's conservative to consider that if you are caught in tsunami flow, your chances of survival, unfortunately, are quite slim. And recent tsunami, like the one in Japan in 2011, demonstrated that even multi-story or engineered concrete and steel buildings can still be damaged by, or destroyed by tsunamis, as shown on the top two pictures that you see there. Next slide, please. This slide is simply to provide an idea of what are the inundation levels. So what level we can plan for the water to reach in the event of both Cascadia and Alaska tsunami. If you look at the table on the left here, for some of the main areas, we report the arrival time of the tsunami. So how much time we would have essentially to get ourselves out of the danger. So Upsitas, which is in Cayucot area, is on the open coast, very close to the fault zone. So we're looking at 25 minutes before the first tsunami waves arrive. However, as we go further inland, down the inlets, then we win more time. We have roughly 50 minutes depending on the areas, and those extra minutes are crucial in being able to running to safety. And then in this table, we have both the inundation level based on current day, and then in the future as sea level rises because of in association with climate change. Next slide, please. So our assessment of the risk was performed within those 25 map sheets for which the layout we shown previously for both Cascadia and the Alaska tsunami sources, because both tsunamis have a very different signature in terms of their impact, and it's important also to plan accordingly based on those different impacts there. For each area, we put a summary table that indicates how many buildings and what length of road would be affected, and areas and communities are grouped accordingly here for the risk assessment. Now, just so you know, we're going to be flipping through a few maps there. Those are for the Cascadia, so the most adverse tsunami, and we just omitted the ones from the Alaska tsunami from this presentation for timeliness. Next slide, please. So this is Upsitas, which is the community that's as at the bottom of the map there. So what you see in blue, that's essentially the water, how far the water would go inland. And what you have in dark little rectangle, those are buildings. And the ones that are highlighted or surrounded by red are the buildings that would be affected by the tsunami flow, which I talked previously about, and would cause severe damage and destruction. The other symbol shows the different critical assets in this locality that could be affected as well. So we see that Upsitas, in the event of a Cascada tsunami, the majority of the community would be affected. Luckily, there's elevated land relatively nearby that people can access on foot up the hill in this area here. So that would be, it's favorable for them to evacuate quickly. It's good that the natural topography allows them to do that. Next slide, please. In this same area, this is essentially just south of the previous map that we've shown there. There's a lot of inhabited islands. For instance, the one you see, the larger one is Walters Island, and we can see that there's a lot of the buildings or cabins or habitations that would be affected by the tsunami, as well as other of the smaller islands. In the case of the islands, however, the evacuation, if needed, if judge needed, that would be much more complicated. So making the decision of risking getting on a boat if possible after the earthquake to try to reach the mainland, or trying to reach higher ground on the island. For some islands, for Walter Islands, for instance, there's a lot of high grounds, but some other islands, not so much there. So there's a lot of careful planning that will need to take place to have a clearly understandable and effective plan in the event of a tsunami, because in this particular case, there won't be much time to think about what to do. Next slide, please. This shows the Fair Harbor area. Fair Harbor, one of the main links to the Cayucut and Upsitas, basically accessible by boat. You see on the left of the map there's a little boat symbol. That's the resident docks. So that's would be affected by the tsunami. But also importantly is that you have two bridges that span that crosses the Cayuc River estuary at that location. And those bridges were actually severely damaged in the 1964 tsunami and were reconstructed. So it's likely that they might be affected as well in the case of both Alaska and Cascadia tsunami as well. So those, the rupture of those links there would make the access or resupply to the Cayucut area more challenging. And that could also affect, people's life and safety, if there's any injuries and if they need to survive on rations as well. But that, that's the recovery from the event there. Next slide, please.
Are we allowed to ask questions, or are we just supposed to listen?
Oh yeah, for the one that arrived, they're going to be in a question section shortly.
At the end?
Yes,
okay.
At the end.
Thank
so
you.
I think, I'm not quite sure how many people were able to join us, but if we were a few, what we can do is to go quite quickly over these maps, because there's a lot of information, and then we can go back to them and dive into a little bit more details there. But thank you, Susan, for clarifying that. Ukluji, that would be the impact of a Cascadia tsunami. We see that the impacts are limited to closer to the shoreline, which is a good thing, meaning that the majority of the areas is safe from the tsunami. But we have to be mindful that there's still risks close to the water for both the Cascadia and Alaska tsunami in this case. But thankfully, there's high ground nearby, so as long as you react quickly and you reach for high ground, it reduces the risk. Next slide, please. So here we're looking at the the effects of the tsunami in Zeballos and Hatis. So basically here it's quite, we're looking at more extensive risk and impacts. The majority of the village on the east side of the river there, we can see where a lot of critical assets such as, you know, the police station, the fire station, there's a community hall there, the village office is there as well. That would be severely impacted by a Cascadia tsunami. While the western side of the village there, still there's some hazard that, you know, closer to the shoreline and as well on the fringe of the flooding. Where the flooding ends, you still want to have an offset or kind of a buffer zone for safety, and you want to be on the conservative side and, you know, be some distance above. So have a freeboard above the inundation level, but also have a clear distance away. So you can see that even though if the ELF clinic there's not quite flooded, but it's close to it, it still wouldn't be considered safe. Same thing with the school. This area is relatively flat, meaning that a small change in the water level would then result in a wider, broader area being flooded there. So those are aspects that would have to be kept in mind when formalizing emergency plans and evacuation plans. The next slide just shows south of Pandora Crest on the peninsula there. It's a little bit higher than the rest of the area, but it's still flooded in the case of the Cascadia tsunami. And then in this case, you would have the marine infrastructure, so the wharfs and the docks at Zeballos that would be affected there. Next slide, please. Now we're looking at the village of Tassis. Again, here, just because of the low-lying area, you have quite some extensive flooding and impacts of the tsunami, especially on the east side of the Tassis River as well. Some critical assets would be affected in this event, case of the Cascadia tsunami. And also, we don't see it here, but also the Alaska tsunami has some considerable effects as well in Tassis. Another reason that just like that indicates why there's such an effect is the presence of the river. The river acts as a pathway, in a sense, for the tsunami water to propagate upland and then to spill over the banks of the river there. But as we go on the next slide and we go a little bit more south, we see that the village core, which is on the western shore there of the inlet, is not as affected, thanks to the hill essentially, or the steepness of the area. So yes, the commercial wharf area would be affected, and the buildings there, the building close to the shoreline would be affected, but it would be easy or relatively easy for people to run up the street essentially to higher grounds and then shelter in a dedicated area in this area. So we have the village office wouldn't be affected, neither would be the ELF clinic either. And if you just go down south there, one more slide, you have the Coast Guard station itself wouldn't be affected, but the wharf and the marine infrastructure is going to be impacted. Next slide, and I'm going to pass it to Taryn to essentially, now that we, as part of this project, now we understand what's at risk and what could be damage and what's the danger. Now it's understanding or trying to start the discussion as to, okay, how are we going to minimize those risks and make sure that everybody is safe, right, in one of those catastrophic events. Taryn.
Thanks, Phil, and thanks, Peter. So Sarusha, next slide, please. Yeah, so emergency management, essentially, it's all about sort of 3 steps, right? So the first step is to understand your risks, which I think the science and the engineering and all the mapping that's been done in this project, from a computer simulation and also from that sort of ground truthing, what happened when and what's the stories that come from those events that people have experienced together. It gives us a really good understanding of what are the worst case scenarios for a tsunami. And of course, there's all kinds of other types of tsunamis, but we want to plan for the worst and then, hope for the best. And the way that we do that after we understand our risks is really to make a plan, right? So using our assets, using our strengths, using our creativity and imagination, trying to figure out, what is the plan to address those risks, and also what are the residual risks that we can tolerate, right? So you can't stop a tsunami from coming in completely. So how do you adapt and sort of live with the risk in a responsible way that the community leads? And then essentially, making your kit, right? So what are the things that you need, or the items and the actions that you need to sort of keep that risk at a level that's acceptable to the community members, and for that matter, visitors and others that are coming into to the territory to make use of it. So overall, it's an all of society responsibility. So from the individual level all the way up to, provincial and federal governments, and even in the case of a tsunami, we're looking at, other nations coming in to support, and really it's all hands on deck. And really we're looking at a strengths-based progress, right? So a lot of these communities, relatively remote, perhaps lower in capacities than some of the more major centers. So what are the capacities, what are the resources, and how do you plan accordingly within those community contexts? And then making sure that we're proactive, not reactive. So when an earthquake happens, is not the time to learn where your evacuation route is, right? So at the least of which, it's how do we respond, right? How do people respond to prevent, their fatalities and injuries from tsunamis and from the earthquake shaking as well. And the way that we do that is we think about disasters not only as a singular event, but sort of a cycle, right? So there's the event itself in which you respond to it, and then there's the recovery that happens afterwards to try to get back to a sort of a new normal or a build back better kind of approach. But then there's there's the preparedness and the mitigation sort of before the next disaster to sort of address what can we do and how do we prepare for those events so that we're better off for them. So next slide, please. So we did take a look at recommendations for risk reduction. So being that none of us are from community, it's a difficult task to sort of really give concrete recommendations. But from the math and from the experiences that we bring from, like Phil from Japan, myself from Indonesia, and other places, we really do, there are some low-hanging fruit that we can look at for reducing the risk. They should be specific to each community. As I mentioned, each community context is different, and the risks to each communities are different, as the mapping has said. So each plan should really follow a roadmap that includes, short-term, medium-term, and long-term actions. And these actions should be really led, by community champions, whether that's industries or individuals and families or local governments and band councils. And some of the measures that we've made recommendations on in the report include these listed here. So being aware of the hazard, this project in and of itself is a risk reduction measure, because it really is the first time that we've really mapped out what does that tsunami wave look like when it comes in, and how do we prepare for it. Public alerting and readiness. So this is something, again, we just got to get out of the way of a tsunami when it starts, when that earthquake happens. So how far do we have to go, and how do we get there as quickly as possible? Alerting is a big part of that. And then of course, readiness, having people ready to go with their grab and go bags and on foot, right? In a car won't work in the case of an earthquake that may damage roads. And also if everybody's trying to drive out at once, it really will impede the evacuation process. So being ready to go on foot to high ground and get you and yourself and your loved ones away from that risky area, and your neighbors as well. Evacuation planning, again, lots of work and effort that can be detailed to specific areas for evacuation planning. Longer term, looking at land use. So perhaps you're restricting development in some areas that are at risk, taking critical infrastructure away from the inundation zone, that kind of thing. And then structural mitigation. So can we strengthen buildings, shorelines, et cetera, to withstand some of that impact from the tsunami wave and from the currents. So next slide, please. So just mentioning evacuation planning, I won't go through this slide completely, but just to say that, we looked at these two different events, the Alaska event being a distant event. As Phil mentioned, we could get a tsunami from Japan, from Chile, from the South Pacific. Those generally have smaller impacts, smaller waves. and longer timeframes that we can within which we can evacuate. So in this Alaska scenario that we're using, it's about 3 to 4 hours. In Chile, a Chile event would take probably 18 hours or something. In 1960, it took about 18 hours to get the wave to Vancouver Island. South Pacific, it's more like 20, Japan, something like that. So, but for that local event, again, we feel the shaking. So that's our alert, is that strong and long duration, 5 minutes or so of shaking that knocks you off your feet. That's your warning that a tsunami will be coming. And again, depending on how big that tsunami is and where you are, it could take between sort of 25 to 55 minutes to get to your location. So what does that mean? It means that for your specific site, you might have different actions to take that might be more safe than others. So really the risk assessment helps outline those things, and the evacuation planning and the subsequent emergency response planning should take into consideration these details to really articulate the best course of action for folks when an earthquake and tsunami happen. And then the other thing, I did mention it, but in terms of transportation on land, it's got to be on foot, right? So making sure people understand that they're going to be day or night trying to travel by foot. So that take that in consideration when you're looking at evacuation routes and things. And then as Phil mentioned, over water is really challenging. So how do you determine what's your best course of action when between, say, island A at risk and mainland B, that's a difficult transition or transportation. So how would one do that in a safe way? Again, those are very specific items that need to be detailed. So next slide, please.
Yeah, and that brings us to the conclusions. Essentially, we're going to wrap this up just as a very quick wrap up. So, as we showed, Vancouver Island is particularly exposed to tsunami hazards, especially because, the Cascadia subduction zone is very close, but also it's exposed to distance tsunamis. This project essentially used, three different ways and 3 different pieces to kind of understand, okay, what are those hazards and what could be the risk? And then to do that, we engage with communities and First Nations. I was able, we use computer models to define what is the tsunami, and as well create, maps so that we can communicate that information with everyone, and also support all the planning that Taryn was talking about, the evacuation planning and so on. And very important piece is how we were able to essentially substantiate our model results with firsthand experiences and knowledge from First Nation that's been passed from generation to generation. And their understanding as well of these types of disasters is also helping. And lastly, we provided some maps that shows the hazards over water, and as well as the overland inundation hazards. So in other words, the flooding. Next slide, please. We performed some risk assessments. So we looked at, okay, what would be the buildings, what would be the roads that would be affected, essentially the roads to avoid, or what roads could be damaged by the tsunami flow, after the events itself. And we also identify the assets that that are critical, and the ones that would be affected by the tsunamis there. And basically, we saw that the exposure to tsunamis varies across the study area. It's very specific to each zone. Essentially anywhere near the shoreline, or even if you're in low-lying coastal areas, you could be at risk of tsunami, and obviously anywhere over water as well, you can be susceptible to tsunami risk. But areas that were that's shown quite high risk, especially, is the village of Tassis, the village of Zabalas and Hattis, and the Cayucot area itself, essentially because of all the islands that are there. And people livelihood depends on boating, and people are always on the water, and there's a lot of islets, reefs, and shallow areas there. So you have a lot of the ocean would be very dangerous in that area in the event of Cascadia tsunami. And next slide, back to Taryn.
Yeah, so essentially, what does it mean going forward? So, this study is just an ongoing step. So continuation means essentially discussing tsunami risk with families, with revising and considering this study in existing emergency plans, many of which include sort of earthquake specific and tsunami specific planning assumptions. So with this study, that should either corroborate current plans or perhaps make adjustments. And then giving that sort of impetus for folks that live with the risk, that are living in these communities or visiting these communities, to really prepare personally, right, with the supplies, with plans, with the communications, with their family members and loved ones within the community, but also outside of the community, so that that people know in the event of a tsunami and earthquake, that they can perhaps communicate with them to tell them that they're safe or where they are, or their last known location. And then really the community leads the reactions to the kind of risk and acceptance or tolerance of that risk, or the action that's required to reduce those risks to an acceptable level. So in many cases, this includes volunteer groups or training, perhaps exercises. I know a lot of communities are doing what they call hike to high ground. So essentially training community members to evacuate and doing so in a community building kind of a way. With the activity at the basis. And then again, with the locals, to identify the opportunities and strategies for funding some of the risk reduction measures. So with these kinds of events, they're low probability, high consequence events. So oftentimes they're overshadowed by things like pandemics and regular seasonal floods or storm surges in this area. So how do we look at those risks, but also think about the tsunami risk as part of a comprehensive kind of planning? And so how do we fund those things so that when they happen, we're not caught off guard, and we have that preparedness and readiness at an acceptable level. So next slide.
And that brings us to a wrap. Yeah, that was a lot of information. We started this project in summer of 2020, and we're really excited that we're able to present you the findings this evening finally. And now we a little bit over time here, but we're happy to stick around, and obviously we want to hear from you, and we're more than happy to answer any questions that you may have.